We're here in Split, Croatia for the 23rd annual meeting of the World Society of Cardiothoracic Surgery. We are starting a series of interviews of the important pioneers of cardiothoracic and vascular surgery, and our first interview is with a medical technology pioneer, someone who is responsible for some very important advances in the field, Mr. Manny Villafana.
Well, Stuart, I'm honored to be asked. I've had an enjoyable time doing the work that we've done, and I've met the most interesting people, including you, and some great pioneers in heart surgery. My background goes back to 1940, when I was born in the South Bronx to two Puerto Rican parents. My father, Joaquin, who died when I was 10 years old, and my mom, Elisa, who raised me as best she could as a single parent, raising a poor boy in the South Bronx of New York. Fortunately, I had chances to increase my education just through the work that was being done at a boys' club called Kips Bay Boys Club in the South Bronx, and also through the dedication of some very fine teachers at St. Luke's School and Cardinal Hayes High School. When I became 20 years old, I was able to secure a job at a company called Radio Engineering Labs, in which it allowed me to learn some of the electronics that I was able to use later on in developing some products. With their help, I was then later on able to secure a job at my first medical company called Picker X-Ray, which at the time was the world's largest X-ray company. In one of its divisions, which was called Picker International, I was able to become acquainted with a product called a pacemaker. In fact, I became acquainted with a lot of cardiovascular devices, but in particularly a heart pacemaker. Not being able to go to a university, I was because of the economic situation of my family, and this was at a time before such things as student loans and things like that. I had to concentrate my efforts in learning as much as I could by just reading. One of the products, as I mentioned, that I was handling was a new device called a pacemaker, which was being developed by a company called Medtronic in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Picker was able to secure the representation of that product overseas, so that in turn they made me like a middleman between their overseas distributors and the manufacturer, Medtronic, and I was the guy in the middle. In a few years, I became very knowledgeable of all the players overseas, starting to get to know a variety of doctors overseas. Then Medtronic eventually said to me, "Manny, why don't you come and join us here in Minneapolis?" It was interesting that the first day I landed in Minneapolis, the temperature was minus 15 degrees with a wind chill of minus 43. Which converted to a Celsius scale meant that the wind chill was about 42 degrees below zero. At that position, I became more knowledgeable of what pacemakers did and saw the shortcomings, especially when I was transferred to Latin America, to Argentina, to work with establishing Medtronic directly in Latin America. There I became exposed to all the physicians, the surgeons. I was in surgery virtually every day because at that time it was the heart surgeon that did the implantation of pacemakers. I became familiar with such famous heart surgeons as Zerbini, Giatene, Pisano, and a variety of different heart surgeons of Latin America. During that time, however, the pacemaker unfortunately began to fail early. A typical pacemaker, which was the size of a hockey puck. For some of you who may not know what a hockey puck is, but it's a rather large device, and weighed in the neighborhood of 250 grams to 300 grams, was being implanted in the body, but unfortunately only had a lifetime of approximately 18 to 24 months. I just felt there had to be a better way. In 1971, I met an old friend, Dr. Wilson Greatbatch, who was a marvelous physicist, chemical engineer, electrical engineer, a variety of different technical backgrounds. And he encountered with me while, of all things, I was standing in a paper bathing suit, a wet paper bathing suit. And everybody kind of laughs about that story, but it's true, that I was at a swimming pool, swimming with some friends, and there he was standing in front of me saying, "Manny, what are you doing?" And I said, "No, Bill, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, Manny, I'm developing a new power source." I said, "Do you mind if I get out of my wet paper bathing suit? I'd be happy to talk to you about it." So a few minutes later, I went to his room, and he started to talk to me about a new battery that he was developing, which was a lithium-powered battery. Pacemakers at that time only used mercury zinc batteries that made the pacemaker only last 12 to 18 months. Bill Greatbatch was saying to me that he could make a pacemaker that could last 10 years. So I said to him, "What are you going to do with that battery?" And he said, "Well, tomorrow morning I'm going to Medtronic to see if they would be interested in it." Well, to make a long story short, I approached him a few months later. I said, "Whatever happened to that battery?" He said, "Well, Medtronic rejected it. They felt that it could not be done." So I said to him, "Do you think it can be done?" And he said, "Yeah." At which point I said, "Okay, Bill." Again, to make a long story short, I said, "You make the battery, I'll make a pacemaker. But you promised never to make a pacemaker, and I promised never to make a battery." We shook hands, and we formed two companies. He formed a company to make batteries, and I formed a company to make pacemakers, and that was the founding of Cardiac Pacemakers, Inc., CPI, which today is Guidant. After we successfully introduced that, we then went on to work on other things, and we started working on heart valves. Now, Stuart, do you want me to continue, or where do you want me to stop?
So that's the pacemaker story.
Yeah.
I don't think, though, I think you underemphasized a little bit the importance of that. That was the first lithium-powered pacemaker, but it set the standard for every pacemaker since then. I mean, it made an extraordinary difference.
Right. Every pacemaker uses the three principles that we developed, and that was first to change the components from what we used to call discrete components to hybrid components. All pacemakers today use the hybrid components. We were the first to develop that. Secondly, we did away with mercury batteries, which had to breathe, and made it with a lithium battery, which had greater energy density and did not have to breathe. And then finally, the third thing that we've done was that we hermetically sealed the entire circuit and battery within the pacemaker, so that no moisture or anything from the outside could get into that pacemaker to disturb the circuitry or disturb the battery. All pacemakers today incorporate that technology, but we were the first to do it.
So that's a remarkably successful story, but your story doesn't end there.
Well, it doesn't end only because I was minding my own business and a couple of doctors approached me and said, "Manny, now that you've done the pacemaker, we want you to devote your attention to heart valves." I was first approached by Victor Parsonet, a cardiac surgeon out of New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, still alive, a good friend of mine. And then another person, almost simultaneously, but from Minneapolis, Dr. Dmitry Nikolov, approached me with an idea to make a heart valve, and I decided to pursue it. I approached the guys that we were working with at CPI. I said, guys, we should do a heart valve. And they said, are you crazy, Manny? We are so busy with the pacemaker. We have zero time to do a heart valve, in which case I said, okay, guys, you take over the pacemaker. I'm going to go and try to do a heart valve. And I know you may not believe this, but I knew nothing about heart valves. There were 4 heart valves in the body. I could not even name them. But I immediately hooked up with Nikolov, Dr. Nikolov, and shortly thereafter I hooked up with Professor C. Walt in Lillahai, and through a series of mentors, Nikolov, Lillahai, Dr. H. David Freeberg, and others, I was able to begin working on the heart valve. And we developed the first heart valve ever to be made entirely out of pyrolytic carbon, the first heart valve ever implanted that was a bi-leaflet configuration. And it's interesting, again, that the standard today is that any mechanical heart valve is made out of pyrolytic carbon, has 2 leaflets, and they're all basically the same. And we did that valve. That valve went on to be the gold standard. It is used more than any other prosthesis in the world. There are over 2.5 million people walking around with a St. Jude heart valve. But yet, interestingly enough, about 15 years later, people approached us and said, Manny, you have to get back into heart valves because there's still work to be done. Upon studying that, we found that there were still some limitations of the St. Jude valve, and we began working on the next generation valve, which I call the ATS valve. The ATS valve stands for Advancing the Standard. The standard, of course, was the St. Jude valve. I brought together the exact same engineers, the same doctors, including Dr. Nikolov and Dr. Freeberg, and we again looked at how we could improve the St. Jude valve, and that became the ATS valve, which in my opinion is still the best mechanical valve in the world.
Let me no, because again, Manny, I think you make light somewhat of what an important advance that was. The history of heart surgery is littered with failed valves, starting with the ball and cage valve and various other cage valves and various materials that have been used. So tell us, firstly, what inspired you to make the innovations that made the bi-leaflet valve? Why pyrolytic carbon? And why did you call it St. Jude?
Well, I consider myself an entrepreneur, a creator of things, and if we really think about the initiation of the St. Jude valve, it was just that a couple of noted surgeons approached me and said, why don't you put your energy into developing a heart valve? I felt that it was a challenge. I felt that I studied it quite quickly and realized there was a need. I didn't realize how poor most of the valves that were being used were. It was extraordinary for me to understand that the most commonly used valve in the world at that time, the old ball and cage valve, had a thromboembolic rate of 6% per year. That means a patient with a valve only 3 years would have already had a 18% chance of having a stroke. I just couldn't even believe that, but that was what it was. And that they failed, they would break, they would make noise, they would clog up. It was a variety of different things. So the challenge was there. And in fact, one doctor, Dr. Freeberg, who was one of my mentors, said, Manny, are you sure you want to get into this? Because what you're doing is you're going to take valve disease and then create a heart valve, an artificial heart valve disease. That's how bad valves were at that time. And I said, let's go for it. Now, at the time, there was a material being used in some of the valves called pyrolytic carbon. It was a material, very strong material, that had a less propensity for clotting because it was a negatively charged material. It was a hard material, very hard material. It would last a long time. But it was a valve that had no flexibility, and so as a result, it was difficult to make a valve that was entirely out of pyrolytic carbon. We decided to do that, though. We decided to make a valve that was entirely out of pyrolytic carbon. When part of my team said, well, Manny, why don't we just make the leaflets out of pyrolytic carbon, but the ring will continue to make it out of metal? And I said, guys, no. You know, I just want us to be different. Otherwise, we will not be able to compete effectively with the present valves that are being manufactured. So we continued into some very long nights to try to figure out how to make the ring out of pyrolytic carbon, which again is a material that does not have a lot of flexibility, and so therefore, how do you put the leaflets inside of the ring? We were able to solve that. We never patented how we did that because we wanted to keep it a trade secret. And don't ask me how we do it, Stuart, because although I love you, I cannot tell you that because it's still a trade secret, and I've always honored that. Besides, I like to know something that you don't know. Okay.
And how did you come up with the name St. Jude?
Wow, how long is this video going to be? Because the St. Jude story is a long story, but basically in a nutshell, when I was doing CPI and I was trying to form the company, no one would listen to me because I was coming up with an idea to compete effectively against Medtronic, and no one believed that we could do that. And so I was just having a hard time putting the company together. And as a result, I went to church and prayed. And while I was in church, I just kneeling down in the middle of the day and talking to God, and in front of me there was a prayer card, and the prayer card was to St. Jude. I still carry that card in my wallet every day. I still have that prayer card, and in that prayer card you promise to the patron saint of hopeless cases that you would promote his name. Well, I felt I had a hopeless case, and I promised to promote his name. So I decided to make a novena to him, pray to him, and sure enough, things became better, and I was able to put the company together, and I just kept promoting the name. One day, my wife gave birth to a son. I asked my wife if we could name our new son Jude. She said yes, and we named my son Jude, again, because I wanted to promote the St. Jude name. Unfortunately, the child was born with a congenital condition that threatened his life, and ended up having 5 operations by the time he was 2 months old. 2 of the operations were at the University of Minnesota. 3 of the operations were at the Mayo Clinic. But we were able to solve that problem. And so the young boy grew up, and everybody knows the story, and everybody knows how he became a young man. And so as a result, I decided to name the company again in honor of the name, promoting the name. I said, if I make this valve successfully, it will be in everybody in the world. They'll be carrying a St. Jude name. And so right now there's 2.5 million people walking around with a St. Jude valve. So there's 2.5 million people remembering the St. Jude name. Now the story gets really interesting was that 20 years later, the doctor who operated on my son and saved his life, his wife called me up and said, why don't we celebrate Brian's birthday? Brian being Dr. Neal, who operated on my son. And I said, sure, why don't we come up to my house and we'll go to dinner at one of my restaurants, Manny's Steakhouse, and we'll celebrate his birthday. And the wife said, gee, that'd be great. I said, when's his birthday? And she said, well, his birthday is next Saturday. And I looked at my calendar and I said, well, Saturday is October 26th. She said, that's correct. I said, October 26th is the feast day of St. Jude. So the doctor who operated on my son was born on St. Jude's feast day. And so you can realize how strong the devotion I have for St. Jude and the name. So I hope I've answered that question.
You did.
And that usually costs you a dinner. I only give that story out if you pay me a dinner.
No, Manny, you are not a tremendously successful person, but a very human person. And I think not everybody knows how deeply religion and philanthropy runs through your life. And I know that, and I wanted you to tell the story. I just have two more questions. You have worked with and known all the cardiac surgery pioneers. Most people would say that the father of open heart surgery was Walt Lillihei. I know he was a very close friend of yours. I know also that he came to work with you at St. Jude. And I wonder if you'd just say a few words about Walt Lillihei. He's not here with us anymore, obviously, and any remembrances that you have of his personal and professional life.
He was one of the most wonderful people I have ever met, the most generous with his talents towards me. In 1976 and 77, Walt had some difficulty with income tax. Who doesn't have problems with income tax? And at that time, he was semi-retired, but was no longer doing surgery. And he approached me and he said, Manny, when are you going to put me to work? I was a young man, and I said, here was truly the father of cardiac surgery asking me, the young kid, to put him to work. Well, I was flabbergasted, and I said I couldn't even believe him. So I asked his brother, who happened to be at the same place at the same time, and I said to Rich Lillihei, I said, Rich, is your brother serious about me putting him to work? And Rich said, if you could do that, I would be forever indebted to you. I said, okay. So I went back to Walt and I said, Walt, are you serious? He says, yeah. I said, see me in my office on Monday. He came to my office, and here was a man who was personally involved in the development of 5 different heart valves, who had personally begun the whole story of open heart surgery. The founder of open heart surgery did the first cross-circulation procedure back in the 50s. He was the man that gave us an opportunity to get into the heart, to open up the field of heart surgery. And he wanted to work for me. That was an honor. He started he said, what can I do for you, Manny? And I said, would you educate my staff on the fine things of heart surgery and cardiac surgery and anatomy and physiology, the things that we need to know in detail if we're going to work in heart surgery. He did it. He never asked for a dime. He never asked for any money. He just wanted to do it. We worked together. He did not design the St. Jude valve, but he knew the St. Jude valve very well, and he helped us. He taught us how to promote it properly and opened the doors for us to the top surgeons of the world, because he was the teacher of the top surgeons of the world. So when the professor wanted to come and visit a surgeon, The surgeon was so excited, opened up the doors, and I humbly would just be behind Walt Lillehei, and so he opened up the doors for Walt, and he opened up the doors for me, and that was just the great things that he did. But we went on to go beyond just a working relationship. We went on to be friends. He also helped me with some philanthropy work that I did by taking money out of his own pocket and helping some of the things that I was doing. I think the greatest honor that I had from Walt was the time when my wife asked him to join a birthday party that was being held for me, and he was the guest speaker, he was the MC, he was the guy that ran that entire birthday. And if you wanted to have a great birthday, Walt was the man to put on a birthday. He knew medicine and he knew how to have fun. And he was just a great guy to me. Every birthday, every year, he would call me and say, "Manny, happy birthday." And we lost him on July 5th, 1999. And it was a great loss, but I have wonderful memories of Walt. You yourself, Stuart, worked with him and know him and know that what I'm saying is true. He was an exciting, great man to know.
Yeah. Manny, finally, you've been responsible for a huge amount of the technology that we use today. And if you step back 30 years, there's been unbelievable advances, and many of which you've been responsible for. I would like you to look into the future, 20 or 30 years, and tell us where you think that we're going to be. What are the next advances? Where is heart surgery going to be in another 2 or 3 decades?
That is a hard question because I think only God knows the future. But if you're asking me to make some predictions of the future, I have to say that unfortunately, I see some clouds looming on that future. I think the spirit of innovation is being damaged excessively by the over amount of regulation that's involved in today's society. When one develops a product or when one develops a new surgical technique, the surgeon knows of the risk. He or she knows of the risk that is involved. The regulators want zero risk. There is no such thing as zero risk when you're developing anything new. And they try to regulate it to the point where there is supposedly zero risk, and of course, we never reach zero risk. As a result, it's becoming ever so difficult to develop new products to the point that the engineering spirit, the creative spirit is being damaged. The surgeons are not getting the best possible products. The financing to do these tasks is getting more and more difficult to find because the investors understand how long some of these technologies will take. I see today some shortcuts being formed that are creating problems. I am not happy what I see in some new valve technologies that are being developed. I am not happy to see things failing in products when we did not have those kinds of failures in the past. So when I look deeper into it, I'm saying, why are we failing now when we didn't fail in the past? And I see some shortcuts in technology, some shortcuts in quality controls happening. That is starting to bother me. I am presently working on a concept of making cardiac surgery, bypass surgery better. We're working very diligently in studying this technology. We feel we have a good technology, but we are constantly fighting the regulatory hurdles and the reimbursement hurdles that is hurting us. And I'm sorry that you asked the question, but I have to say that I'm a little bit concerned of our future. We, as surgeons and developers, you and I and the surgeons that we know, have devoted our lives to trying to give better patient care. That's our life. That's our motto. We took an oath for that. Okay? And I trust you are still doing that. I know that I am still doing that, but it is with great difficulty that we have to do that.
Well, Manny, thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of the Society. I personally thank you for your wonderful contributions to medicine, to surgery, to the Society, and I'm proud to call you a friend and have been for many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to the Society.